So, do you want to do the first ever Majority Cast history lesson?
Wow, I get the honor of this.
I'm
All
honored
right.
to give you the honor, Your Honor.
Well, I don't know how well researched mine will be. I'll just put that out there. It's more of a discussion. But I do have figures. I have facts and figures here, but it's really honestly more of a discussion. But I wanted to talk about Final Fantasy VII.
Hmm.
Because it's always very curious to me that Final Fantasy VII is the big kahuna, the one that took RPGs out of Japan and made it like a worldwide phenomenon. And I'm always curious like why this game? Because once people have played enough RPGs, and I don't want to say a lot of people don't like this game because I think it's always well regarded, but they always end up finding games that's like, oh, this is better than Final Fantasy VII. Like they'll find, I don't even want to say many games because it is a very good game, but I think Chrono Trigger is far superior to Final Fantasy VII. I think Final Fantasy IX is far superior to Final Fantasy VII. There's a lot of games that are better in the same time frame. I mean, you could even argue Final Fantasy VI is way better than Final Fantasy VII. A lot of people think that, and it came before with inferior hardware. So I always found it interesting that Seven was the one. So I looked it up, and I just wanted to get a taste of what the world was like and what was going on. And I learned, and this is based off the wiki, but I do have a Shmuplations interview that I'll be referencing as well. But Final Fantasy VII was one of the first video games produced at a blockbuster AAA scale. It was the most expensive video game ever developed up until then. It cost $45 million to develop and $100 million for marketing, which usually, from what I've seen, and this is actually from the movie industry, so it's maybe different, but in the movie industry, usually you take the budget of a movie and double it, and that would be adding marketing. So this actually is like tripling it for the marketing, which is interesting because I do remember it. And I apologize for my voice, by the way. I was at a Misfits concert last night,
Wow.
and so my voice is completely gone. It was AFI and the Misfits, so cool show. Um, but anyway, so if my voice breaks like a 13-year-old, maybe I'm just transforming myself back into when Final Fantasy VII came out. So, uh, yeah. It's super expensive marketing. I remember it being all over the video game magazines and stuff. I remember just pictures of them. So it does make sense that it was so expensive to market. But if you adjust it for inflation, and I don't know when this exactly was written, so because we just had a pretty big inflation boom. But this says it's the equivalent of $245 million adjusted for inflation. So pretty expensive. I know like now it's not as big. Like Grand Theft Auto 5, I think was like 500 million. Um, Red Dead, I'm sure. I think even like Star Wars, The Old Republic of all things, cost like $1 billion. So it's might not be as crazy now, but certainly back then when games were considered like toys, this was kind of a big deal.
Well, even for Star Wars, they at least had the assets from LucasArts or the films to pull from. What was Square Enix pulling from?
True, true. And fascinatingly, from the Shmuplations interview I read, they only had a year to make this game, like literally from the ground up, which is kind of crazy. Um, but you can kind of see it once you've played the game, and we played it for the button mappers. There's elements of the game that feel very rushed and like cobbled together. 'Cause, like I remember Midgar specifically was like so well thought out and like an incredible like Midgar is the most memorable part of Final Fantasy VII. And to me, it's like there's Midgar and then there's post Midgar, and all that stuff is kind of like it's still entertaining, but it's not nearly as memorable as the first part. And I think Midgar is where they had all their eggs, and they're like, oh shoot, we got to finish this game. So then they rushed and did all that. Uh, but all right, let's see. It came out in 1996, and it sold. It actually had pre-orders, believe it or not. Actually, it came out in 97. I'm sorry, early 97. The game had 1.1 million pre-orders about 10 days before release, which I didn't even know they had pre-orders back then. I thought pre-orders were like a gen, number gen stuff. I don't know them. Anyway, I thought they came later than that, but I guess they were there. Maybe it was a Japanese thing only. I don't know. But they had 1.1 million pre-orders, increasing to 1.83 million pre-sales shortly before release. The game sold on the first day of release in Japan. It sold 1.75 million copies. In 2 days, it sold over 2 million. Within 3 days of release, 2.3 million. That's in Japan. So that's pretty crazy. And then by April, it sold nearly, and it released in January. By April, it sold nearly 3 million units, and then more than 3 million by July. Now, in North America, it sold more than 330,000 copies on its debut, which was higher than any video game
in America.
The game is in America.
Gotcha.
The game it surpassed, by the way.
Don't tell me.
Star Fox 64.
Wow, you told me.
At 300,000. Oh, you're saying? Oh, I thought you said tell me.
That's all right.
I was like, okay.
I would have got it wrong. I would have said like Paper Mario or something.
You would have said Paper Mario?
No, not really. I would have said Chrono Trigger, but
really, Chrono Trigger didn't sell that well. I don't think.
I just thought you were gonna do like a comparable game that like we've talked about or something. But.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it was more than any game, which is kind of crazy. Went on to sell more than 1.5 million copies during its first week of release. It helped the PlayStation break a long spell of Nintendo 64 dominance in North America. Topped the monthly sales chart, entered the top 3 on the video game rental chart. Let's see, I want to get to the worldwide. By 1998, it sold more than 6 million copies. And by 2007, the PlayStation version of the game had sold more than 10 million copies. Or about 10 million copies, actually. This game is insane. Because remember, too, I mean, nowadays you can break that, but it's important to remember, too, that at the time, gaming was not where it is now, where it's like a household thing. It was way more of like a market, like a niche market.
Well, even just the hype of lining up overnight, like that doesn't really exist to the same extent. You don't really see like physical games, like they're that craze. Like I understand why you thought there weren't pre-orders, because I think I've seen like classic footage of like Super Mario Galaxy releasing and people lining up out the doors, and there being like lines in shopping malls. And you got to imagine 1.75 million, sales, maybe like, let's say that's 1.5 million people minimum lined up all across Japan, this small island.
Yeah.
What an experience.
It's got to be mind blowing. I mean, and especially in Japan, it's like they have such a Japan, like a JRPG culture there, especially back then. It was like Dragon Quest, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy are the big ones, but they had all the Atlas games that I'm sure were the SMT shit, like stuff like we wouldn't even get. So they were, and even to them, this was a big deal. So
this seems bigger than any Dragon Quest, even in Japan.
We could look up the sales figures, but let's see. I'm trying to think about what they were. What would be like? Okay, so Dragon Quest 6.
That's a bad example. I feel like
that would have been the closest date wise.
Date wise, yeah, but sales wise, this was like one.
One? You would compare it to one?
Because what's the trajectory? I feel like one was like the biggest. I know it was like a slump or something. Like Dragon Quest 3 or 4, it like started to drop down. And then 5, it picked back up a little bit. But it was like the total sales were around 3 million. That's globally. As far as a cultural phenomenon goes, in Japan, a Japanese cultural phenomenon, I think 1 is probably the biggest phenomenon in the Dragon Quest series up to that point.
Didn't 1 not sell as great?
I don't know. We could look up VG charts if you want. You could do that.
Man, this thing's only giving me the DS one. I want the SNES one. Is that real? Anyway, whatever. But yeah, it's just crazy how big this one was. And clearly they spent a lot of money marketing it. So it almost makes me wonder too if they learned from this that you need to market these like you would a movie, like you would like a Hollywood blockbuster.
I think you were right about the numbers, by the way. I guess 3 was the biggest phenomenon sales wise. 1 was actually the worst of the first 6. But they're all like 2 to 3 million sellers. Dragon Quest 3 at 3.9 million.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my thing too is also like you started with why? Like is this game that much better than games at the time? You know, it's frequently hailed as kind of like that masterpiece, you know, and the same calibers as like the Ocarina of Time or the Symphony of the Night, kind of the game changer. And, you know, I was actually thinking about this game earlier today, playing Symphony of the Night. I won't say why, but I guess, you know, I'll save that. But on the same scale of like, you know, being groundbreaking. What's the most groundbreaking part of Final Fantasy VII? Is it the new setting, the dystopian setting applied to a traditional RPG? Because, you know, SMT and Earthbound both play with that formula too. So that can't only be it. Maybe it went into marketing. You said double the amount, 10 or $100 million spent. Yeah. Was that it?
Yeah, 100 million.
100 million on marketing. So probably a lot of advertisements. Maybe it's like it was the big PlayStation seller. So maybe it was boasting things that weren't really demonstrated. Maybe, you know what's interesting? Since so much was put in marketing, it makes you wonder if more money was put into certain PlayStation 1 games even up to that point, and they actually look and perform better than Final Fantasy VII. Maybe there are games that had more than $50 million invested in the game, but just didn't quite grab the consumers to the same extent.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think would contribute to it, and this is off the Shmuplations interview, they were talking to Sakaguchi about it, and they were talking about choosing the hardware for Final Fantasy VII. And he said it was starting to become clear to us what the memory capacity for the different next-gen consoles would be. Our games were going to need a huge amount of memory. The Final Fantasy VI CG demo we made for the SIGGRAPH exhibition took 20 megs all by itself. So they made like a demo of what it could look like in 3D. We thought that demo had a lot of visual impacts. There wasn't really much question about which hardware we were going to use. So they decided they have to go with CD-ROM, not just because it could hold a lot of memory, but because of the price. You could buy the games off CD-ROM for 5,000 to 6,000 yen. We tried to have the same pricing for games like Bahamut Lagoon, Gun Hazard, and other late Super Famicom games. But using cartridge ROM meant those games had to be sold for over 10,000 yen. So they were the cost to make them must have just been astronomical.
$100 games.
Yeah, and I remember that. I remember seeing that in like old magazines for Super Nintendo games. Even in America, they were constantly. That's why, like, when people are like freaking out that games are going up to $70, one, they should have been that years ago because of inflation. So it's a miracle that they hadn't, but it's probably because of DLC that they were able to keep the price down. But games back in the Super Nintendo era were clear over $60. Like there was, I think Chrono Trigger was probably like $80, $90 in places. It's insane that they haven't gone up to
Majora's
like
Mask was too. I think you needed the expansion drive in your N64 as well. So if you didn't have that, you know, you couldn't really save your progress.
Yeah, that's super true. There were a number of games. I remember Perfect Dark being like that. Yeah, so I mean, this has been going on for forever. So it's interesting to see them actually trying to find ways to keep the cost down. They're trying to release these.
It's another multi-discer, though. You know, it's the funny, like, tragedy of the PS1 RPGs, like the Chrono Cross Disc 2 being kind of a joke. And then, like, the Final Fantasy VII, the rest of the discs, like, I mean, Midgar is what people remember. And I think it calls attention to people's attention span in RPGs, especially in the West, since we're the ones that don't stop talking about freaking Final Fantasy VII. A lot of people probably didn't play past Midgar.
I didn't for the longest time.
I did. I played past Midgar, and then I was like, "What the hell is this?" And then I put it down, and then
like I got past Midgar, and it's like, oh, it's like like a generic Final Fantasy game, and then I put it down. And there's great stuff to be had, but it is seem a little jarring. I agree. He was hoping to have Final Fantasy VII be a 2-disc game at the price of 5,800 yen. It's 3 discs, I believe, the original, wasn't it? Final Fantasy VII.
I have it. I have all the other ones on PS1. I didn't really buy it.
It's in the garage. It's not worth digging out. Maybe it's 2 discs. I don't remember, but I remember it's certainly more than 1 disc. So yeah, I think one of the big selling points of it, and one of the reasons it caught on, was the graphics. Was they showed probably, and this might seem scummy now, and it kind of is scummy. I bet you, and I wasn't alive, or I was alive, but I wasn't like really aware at the time. But I think they probably showed a lot of cutscene footage when they were marketing this game, and a lot less actual gameplay footage. Well, they probably showed a lot of combat footage because the combat looks nice. Mm-hmm. But when you see those like close-ups of the characters and they look so like nowadays, people always reference how goofy they look.
Roblox.
And they look kind of like little cartoon characters. And I admit that they do look kind of goofy, but I'm of the age where I feel the charm of it. So to me, it doesn't look bad. I don't look at it and think how goofy it looks. But I could see people that didn't grow up with it being like, wow, that looks really stupid. And it is kind of fascinating to think that Final Fantasy VII, like they look like you said, Roblox. They look really goofy. And literally Final Fantasy X came out, what, like 3 years later? 4 years later? And looks like comparatively like completely realistic. And granted, it's a console generation up, but it really is just a stark reminder of just how fast technology can move. And that at one point, Final Fantasy VII completely revolutionized everything in America. And then 4 years later, it looks basically, comparatively photorealistic. And people are like, another Final Fantasy entry.
Do you feel like not Tifa's, what the hell is her name? The flower girl?
Oh, well, okay. It's either Aerith or Eris. I can never remember what the correct one is, if there is a correct one. But it's one of those.
It's one of them. Do you think Flower Girl's death had a bearing on popularity?
No, I doubt it.
Okay. I feel like that's one of those moments that people don't shut up about. It's like just everybody knows it. You can't even have it spoiled because you know it.
Yeah, well, I think it's a cool moment. It's great that it's there and it's a popular thing to look at. But it's a moment in the. If you're asking like if it's one of the reasons people rate it highly, maybe. Is it one of the reasons it was sold a lot? No, I'm sure it had nothing to do with that. But maybe it's why they rate it highly. Maybe that was their first introduction of like true tragedy in a video game. Because I always think about this too, and it's almost like terrifying to think about. But before Final Fantasy VII, all gamers were bro gamers in America. It was like why, like there aren't that many people that are playing the RPGs, so we're basically all essentially the people that would be playing Call of Duty. Granted, Call of Duty wasn't out, but those are the kind of games you would play. And then Final Fantasy VII came out, and now all of a sudden everybody there's a group of people that are like, holy shit, I think I like this. I didn't even know that I like this. So it's like when some bro dude is like talking to you about what he saw in Game of Thrones, right? They're like, oh, it was sick. It was like a thing. Well, but it's the same thing with Aerith dying. It's like that was their first thing where they're like, oh, games can actually be emotional. And I don't really know how to handle it yet. But, a portion of them will then make that their thing. And then now it's just another. Like, there's millions of games that have that in it. But this was the one that they saw first.
Right. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting point in time. Thanks for bringing attention to it.
Yeah, I think about this game a lot, and I really do like playing it. I think the materia system is fantastic. Um, there's a lot of good things to be said about this game. It's not my favorite, but it is a really cool game, and the remakes are really good too. Just throwing it out there.
We've now played 2 Final Fantasies with Alex.
That's true.
We haven't archived either.
That's true.
Something.
The first one, I don't think the channel was up yet. The 7 one.
Oh yeah.
And then 1, I don't have word that he's finished it yet. So.
Oh, he's right there. Just let him on. Let him finish at boss 4. Call it an archive. Anyways, thanks for the majority sermon. Appreciate it. You did it. You rocked it. The first one ever.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.